What if the biggest misunderstanding in modern life is not about politics, money, or technology, but about progress itself? What if the reason we keep misreading the future is that we keep telling ourselves the wrong story about how change happens? Matt Ridley's How Innovation Works is built around that challenge. It argues that the breakthroughs shaping your life did not arrive as magic, and they did not descend from a handful of isolated geniuses. They emerged through messy chains of trial, error, exchange, competition, persistence, and timing. And if you want to keep working on your self-development while accessing expert summaries from many of the world's most renowned authors, don't forget to like, share, and comment on this video, because the whole point here is to build a sharper way of seeing the world, not just to collect facts. Ridley presents innovation as the hidden force behind rising living standards, modern health, new industries, and the strange upheavals of our age, while also warning that it can be encouraged or quietly strangled. Ridley is a British science writer with Oxford degrees in zoology, a long journalistic career that included The Economist, and a wider body of work that repeatedly returns to evolution, exchange, and bottom-up change. That background matters, because this book is not just a catalog of inventions. It is Matt Ridley bringing together the themes that run through his earlier work, especially the belief that human prosperity grows when ideas meet, mix, and get tested in the real world. So from the start, you can hear the voice of an evolutionary thinker, not just a business writer. And if that already resonates with you, type "I choose progress" in the comments. It is short, easy, and perfectly suited to the spirit of this book, because Ridley is really asking whether we are willing to identify with progress not as a slogan, but as a discipline of curiosity, experimentation, and courage. The opening idea of the book is deceptively simple. Invention and innovation are not the same thing. That distinction powers everything that follows. For Ridley, an invention can be a prototype, a clever design, a scientific insight, or a new mechanism. Innovation begins later, when that invention becomes practical, dependable, affordable, and widespread enough to matter in ordinary life. In other words, the hard part is very often not imagining something new. The hard part is turning that fragile new thing into something people can actually use. Ridley frames innovation almost as a cousin of evolution. It is a process of producing improbable but useful arrangements of the world, then letting reality decide what survives. That is why he sees innovation as mysterious, cumulative, and often badly understood by economists, executives, and policymakers alike. The book is his attempt to solve that puzzle not through abstract theory first, but through stories. And the structure is crucial. Ridley says he wrote the book in a bottom-up way, first by telling stories across major sectors of human life, then by drawing patterns from them, then by confronting the obstacles and failures that keep innovation from flourishing. The first large movement of the book covers energy, public health, transport, food, low-technology innovation, communication and computing, and prehistoric innovation. Only after that sweep does he stop and ask what these stories collectively reveal. Then, in the closing stretch, he turns toward economics, frauds and failures, resistance, and what he calls an innovation famine. That architecture matters, because the book wants you to feel the evidence accumulate before the manifesto arrives. It wants the lesson to emerge the way Ridley thinks innovation itself emerges, through a long sequence of practical examples. The first great arena is energy, and Ridley begins where he thinks the modern world truly came alive: the controlled conversion of heat into work. He treats this as one of the decisive turning points in human history, because it underpins the steam engine, the Industrial Revolution, and much of the prosperity that followed. But the key lesson is not simply that steam changed everything. The lesson is that the steam engine resists the myth of the lone genius. Ridley's account starts with a muddle of names, partial designs, and overlapping contributions. The point is not to erase individual brilliance, but to show that history's clean origin stories are usually false. Innovation, in his telling, is full of half-successes, forgotten contributors, and gradual refinement. The people who matter most are not always the ones who first imagined a principle. They are often the ones who make the principle work reliably enough to change the world. That is why the energy chapter naturally expands from early steam into James Watt, Thomas Edison, turbines, nuclear stagnation, shale gas, and even fire. Watt matters not because Ridley thinks history belongs to heroic individuals, but because Watt improved efficiency and usefulness. Edison matters even more because he becomes a near-perfect symbol of Ridley's theory. On Ridley's account, Edison did not simply invent the light bulb in the simplistic schoolbook sense. Multiple people were converging on similar ideas. What made Edison central was his almost industrial commitment to iteration. He treated innovation itself as a process to be organized, funded, tested, and improved. In the book's logic, that is what separates a bright idea from a civilization-changing product. It is not enough to have the spark. You need the grind, the patience, the surrounding system, and the commercial imagination. The wider energy chapter keeps pressing this same lesson. Turbines show how a core principle can echo through many forms. Nuclear power introduces the phenomenon Ridley calls disinnovation, where sectors that once promised rapid progress become slowed by regulation, fear, cost, or institutional sclerosis. Shale gas becomes an example of surprise, a field where important advances came together in a way many elites did not expect. And fire itself reminds the reader that the human story has always been, in part, a story about learning to capture energy and put it to work. What Ridley wants you to feel here is that energy innovation spreads only when it fits into a larger ecology. Materials, incentives, infrastructure, legal permission, economic need, and cultural tolerance for experimentation. A technology can be ingenious and still stall. It can be imperfect and still win. From there, Ridley moves into public health, and the emotional temperature changes. Instead of engines and factories, we get vulnerability, disease, panic, courage, and rescue. But the pattern is the same. He begins with the history of smallpox inoculation, especially the part played by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in bringing variolation into Britain after learning about it through the Ottoman world. This is a perfect Ridley story because it upends prestige. The practice was not born in a modern laboratory, and its early champions were not simply establishment authorities calmly rolling out consensus science. It traveled across cultures. It arrived through observation, adaptation, and a willingness to trust a useful method before theory fully caught up. The same chapter then moves through Pasteur, chlorinated water, vaccine development, penicillin, polio, mosquito nets, and harm reduction. The public health message is unmistakable. Innovation in medicine is not pure genius meeting pure data. It is courage meeting uncertainty, then being refined by evidence and scale. This public health section may be the clearest place where Ridley fights the myth that progress is delivered by anointed experts acting from above. Curl Kendrick and Grace Eldering, who developed an effective whooping cough vaccine, become emblematic of painstaking, community-linked innovation rather than theatrical discovery. Fleming's penicillin story shows that luck matters, but luck alone is worthless without the long work of turning an accident into treatment. The story of polio adds another layer. Even a desperate problem with huge public urgency still takes time, testing, setbacks, and systems of deployment. Then Ridley arrives at malaria, where insecticide-treated bed nets become one of his favorite examples of practical innovation saving lives on an enormous scale. The lesson is that a breakthrough does not need to look glamorous. If it solves a real problem at scale, it belongs in the same story as the grandest technical triumphs. Even tobacco harm reduction appears in this chapter, because Ridley wants to stretch the reader's definition of what counts as practical public health progress. Then comes transport, and here Ridley's worldview becomes beautifully concrete. Railways, propellers, internal combustion, diesel, powered flight, jets, safety systems, and the economics of cost all appear, but not as isolated milestones on a neat timeline. Instead, transport reveals how innovation behaves like a network. Railways need good locomotives, but also good track, finance, engineering know-how, and sufficient demand. Early flight needs daring, but also obsessive testing, data gathering, and practical adaptation. Ridley's treatment of the Wright brothers fits his larger argument perfectly. He emphasizes that they learned from other experimenters, gathered information widely, and refined their machine relentlessly, while better connected rivals carrying more prestige did not necessarily outperform them. Innovation, then, is not just about brilliance. It is about who solves the bottleneck, who listens, who tests, and who keeps going after failure. This chapter is also where Ridley's systems thinking really bites. He keeps asking practical questions. Who built the surrounding infrastructure? Who made the machine cheap enough? Who reduced the risk enough for mass adoption? Who improved safety enough to turn a thrilling novelty into an ordinary expectation? These questions pull transport history away from romantic invention stories and toward the unglamorous work of scale. That is why diesel can be both tragedy and triumph. That is why jets matter, not just because they exist, but because international rivalry, engineering refinement, and cost reduction drove them forward. And that is why the transport chapter feels bigger than transport. It becomes a study in how modern life is built, not by one breakthrough, but by whole ecosystems of aligned improvements. When the book turns to food, it widens again from machines to civilization. Ridley looks at potatoes, synthetic fertilizer, the Green Revolution, biological pest control, gene editing, and the environmental debate about land sharing versus land sparing. What he wants the reader to see is that food innovation has repeatedly delayed or defeated the prophecies of famine that so often haunt modern thought. The section on dwarf wheat genes from Japan and their influence on high-yield varieties is especially revealing, because it shows how local, specific, and historically contingent a world-changing change can be. A genetic trait from one place, moved through researchers and breeding programs, becomes part of a chain that alters food production far away. That is pure Ridley. Recombination across people, places, and time. No single seam looks like destiny. But together, they pull hundreds of millions, even billions of human lives onto a different path. Food also allows Ridley to connect innovation to environmental realism. He argues that higher yield agriculture can, under the right conditions, spare land from being converted to farming and thus leave more room for nature. That is why the chapter ends with a contrast between land sharing and land sparing. It is also why gene editing appears not as a science fiction flourish, but as the latest entry in a much older story of trying to grow more with less. Here again, Ridley is pushing against a popular intuition. He wants the reader to see innovation not as the enemy of the natural world, but often as the way societies reduce pressure on it. Whether one agrees with every policy implication or not, this is one of the book's core emotional moves, turning innovation from something vaguely threatening into something that may be essential for both prosperity and environmental restraint. One of the most charming sections in the whole book is the chapter on low-technology innovation. Ridley uses it to make a larger philosophical point. If you only admire rockets, chips, and gene editing, you have missed half the miracle of civilization. Numbers 0, sanitation fittings, corrugated iron, shipping containers, wheeled luggage, restaurant formats, and the sharing economy all matter because they remove friction from life. They change trade, health, travel, accounting, comfort, and time. This is where Ridley makes the familiar feel astonishing again. Why did it take so long for the wheeled suitcase to become normal? Why should the shipping container deserve almost as much awe as a computer? Why does something as abstract as a better numbering system count as one of humanity's deepest innovations? Because civilization advances not only by adding spectacular powers, but by streamlining ordinary reality. And there is a subtle emotional intelligence in that move. By putting 0 beside corrugated iron, or containers beside cuisine, Ridley is teaching the reader to respect small advances. A better water trap changes sanitation. A better container reorganizes world trade. Better numerical tools reshape commerce and thought. Better dining formats reshape culture and urban life. These are not footnotes to progress. They are the texture of progress. They show that innovation is often about saving effort, saving time, reducing waste, and making complexity manageable. Once you see that, history starts to look different. You stop waiting for the dramatic breakthrough and start noticing the quiet redesigns that transform daily life. The chapter on communication and computing brings the argument into territory most modern viewers already feel close to, but Ridley still refuses the usual mythology. The telegraph produces the first big collapse of distance. Wireless opens another age of connection. The computer does not belong honestly to one inventor because it emerges from overlapping streams of mathematics, engineering, hardware, logic, and practical need. The transistor shrinks and shrinks, which changes not just cost, but reliability and scale. Search engines appear with surprisingly uncertain futures, and social media transforms public life in ways even the innovators did not fully predict. Artificial intelligence then arrives not as a detached miracle, but as one more continuation of the same long chain: combination, miniaturization, data, competition, and cumulative refinement. This is where one of Ridley's most interesting tensions becomes visible. Innovation often looks inevitable in retrospect, because many of the necessary ingredients were accumulating at once. Yet it also remains deeply unpredictable, because no one can know in advance which combination will dominate, which application will matter most, or which side effects will shape society. Ridley even notes that technologies can bring surprises that cut against earlier hopes. In his discussion around social media, for example, there is a sense that tools of connection do not automatically produce harmony. They can fragment attention and intensify echo chambers. So even here, in the digital realm, where Ridley sees much contemporary dynamism, he insists that innovation is not a morality tale. It is a force that creates possibilities, then leaves society to cope with the consequences. Then comes one of the boldest pivots in the book: prehistoric innovation. Ridley stretches the frame back before modern capitalism, before patents, even before writing, and asks the reader to see innovation in farming, dog domestication, the Stone Age leap, cooking with fire, and finally, life itself. This chapter serves two purposes. First, it reminds us that cumulative novelty is ancient. Humans were already transforming their niche long before modern institutions gave those transformations new speed. Second, it reinforces the evolutionary logic beneath the whole book. Innovation is not limited to sleek labs or venture capital. It is a deep feature of life, rearranging the world through experimentation, adaptation, and selection. The modern age did not invent novelty. It amplified a pattern that was already there. By now, Ridley has earned the right to stop telling mostly stories and start naming principles. This is the hinge of the entire book. And if you feel the thread pulling together at this point, leave a second comment ritual in the simplest possible form. I build the future. Because Ridley's quiet challenge to the reader is not merely intellectual. It is existential. Do you see yourself as someone waiting for progress to happen elsewhere, or as someone who understands that progress is produced by imperfect people experimenting in the world? That is the identity shift hidden inside this chapter. So what does Ridley think the evidence shows? He says innovation is gradual, different from invention, often serendipitous, fundamentally recombinant, dependent on trial and error, and always more collective than the lone genius myth suggests. He says it becomes inexorable once enough complementary conditions exist, even though the precise path remains impossible to predict. He adds that innovation follows a hype cycle, thrives better under fragmented governance than over-centralized control, and increasingly means doing more with fewer resources rather than simply consuming more. In one sense, this chapter is the book's explicit thesis statement. In another sense, it is the moment when earlier stories snap into a recognizable pattern. Steam, vaccines, railways, containers, search, agriculture, and sanitation all stop looking like unrelated episodes and start looking like examples of one deeper process. That chapter is also where Ridley most clearly tries to replace one mental picture with another. He wants to dethrone the myth of the miraculous breakthrough and replace it with an evolutionary view of civilization. Lots of variants, lots of dead ends, lots of recombinations, then selection by usefulness and spread through adoption. The image is less glamorous, but more powerful. It explains why multiple people can stumble toward the same idea at once. It explains why credit is so hard to assign neatly. And it explains why progress often seems obvious only after the fact. Once a successful innovation is everywhere, it becomes hard to remember how contingent and fragile it once looked. The economics chapter pushes those insights into theory and policy. Ridley argues that innovation generates increasing returns and transforms possibilities in a way standard economic models have often struggled to capture. Growth driven by innovation is not just more output. It changes what can be produced, what can be imagined, and what becomes cheap enough to democratize. He insists this process is mostly bottom-up. It comes from problem solvers close to practical needs, from entrepreneurs, tinkerers, firms, networks, and users, not from a central intelligence directing civilization from above. Then comes one of his most provocative claims. Science is often as much the child of innovation as its parent. In other words, theory frequently arrives after practice has already opened the door. Steam engines preceded thermodynamics as a science. Flight advanced before aerodynamics was fully mature. Usefulness often outruns explanation. Ridley also argues that innovation cannot simply be forced onto unwilling consumers. For him, a genuine innovation must satisfy real wants better than the old option. That sounds obvious, but it anchors a larger point. Progress is not what authorities announce. It is what people actually adopt. He then turns to interdependence, making the case that innovation deepens specialization and exchange, which in turn expands the collective intelligence of society. On jobs, he rejects the old fear that new technology creates permanent mass unemployment. Specific roles do vanish, and transitions can be painful, but innovation also creates new needs, new sectors, and new forms of labor. Finally, he becomes deeply skeptical of large incumbent firms and of regulatory systems that freeze markets in place. For Ridley, concentrated power and bureaucratic drag are recurrent enemies of renewal. That leads naturally to the chapter on fakes, frauds, fads, and failures, which is one of the reasons this book does not collapse into naive optimism. Ridley knows that not everything branded as innovation deserves celebration. Some breakthroughs are scams. Some are fantasies. Some are overfunded dead ends. Some are products chasing novelty without solving a meaningful problem. By placing fake bomb detectors, phantom games consoles, Theranos, overhyped transport visions, and the diminishing returns of some mature product categories in one frame, he makes a sharp distinction between real iterative progress and theatrical pseudo-innovation. Novelty is not enough. Design is not enough. Hype is not enough. If the thing cannot truthfully deliver, scale, or survive scrutiny, it belongs to a different category. But even that chapter circles back to one of Ridley's deepest convictions. Failure is not a regrettable side note to innovation. It is part of the engine. Steam engines failed. Locomotives failed. Aircraft failed. Companies failed. Experiments failed by the thousand. What matters is whether a culture can absorb failure without learning the wrong lesson. Ridley admires environments where unsuccessful attempts do not produce total paralysis, because he thinks fear of failure is often more dangerous than failure itself. Progress requires repeated swings. Slow, overcautious systems may look responsible, but they can end up preventing the very learning that innovation depends on. The chapter on resistance to innovation might be the most recognizable to modern audiences because the pattern is timeless. Ridley lines up examples of novelty being attacked as dangerous, immoral, destabilizing, or socially corrupting. Coffee becomes a case study in moral panic. Biotechnology becomes an example of innovation delayed and demonized. Herbicide debates show how fear can outrun evidence. Mobile telephony illustrates regulatory obstruction. Intellectual property becomes, in Ridley's hands, less a pure incentive system than a possible bottleneck. Bagless vacuum cleaners show incumbents fighting challengers. Permissionless digital innovation becomes a final example of what happens when experimentation escapes traditional gatekeepers. Across centuries, the same drama repeats. Vested interests, anxious publics, and cautious authorities often push back hardest just when change is becoming useful. And this is where Ridley's politics become fully explicit. For most of the book, his worldview hums underneath the stories. Here it steps into the light. He believes innovation flourishes where people can test ideas quickly, where trade and exchange are open, where regulators are permissive rather than suffocating, where incumbents cannot easily capture the rules, and where experimentation is not strangled by precautionary culture. He is suspicious of systems that demand certainty before trial, because trial is often how certainty is produced. He is equally suspicious of legal and institutional arrangements that reward rent-seeking over experimentation. If this summary is giving you a clearer map of how progress actually happens, this is a great moment to like, share, and comment again. Not as a favor to the channel, but because ideas like this spread the way innovation spreads, person to person, through networks, when somebody finds them useful enough to pass on. All of that culminates in Ridley's warning about an innovation famine. This is one of the book's most memorable and most contested claims. He argues that although modern life feels saturated with change, much of the West has seen slower progress in the physical world than in the digital one. Software races ahead. Semiconductors race ahead. But many sectors involving molecules, machines, infrastructure, and regulation move more slowly than we tell ourselves. In his view, this is not because humanity has run out of ideas. It is because rules, delays, institutional caution, and vested interests have made experimentation costlier in many of the domains where we most need it. That argument grows sharper when Ridley points to vaccines, diagnostics, energy, transport, and genetically modified crops. His claim is not that innovation has stopped. It is that it is being channeled into the areas least constrained by regulation, especially bits rather than atoms. The same final section also turns to geography. Ridley argues that innovation tends to cluster in particular places for particular periods because certain societies become unusually open to trade, talent, recombination, and experimentation. He sees recent Chinese dynamism as real, especially in digital systems and infrastructure. Yet he also warns that political authoritarianism can choke the very energy it temporarily releases. That double move is classic Ridley, admiration for rapid practical advance, combined with a deep conviction that freedom ultimately matters more than command. The book ends, then, not in despair, but in conditional optimism. Progress can continue. The future can be brighter, but only if societies remember what actually nourishes innovation, instead of congratulating themselves on progress while building systems that quietly suppress it. Now, to be fair, how innovation works is not a neutral map with no edges. It is an argument with a definite point of view. Reviewers broadly praised its storytelling and its wealth of examples, but some also argued that Ridley downplays the role of governments, public funding, and publicly backed science in certain innovations. That criticism matters because the second half of the book is openly polemical and clearly aligned with a freedom-first, market-friendly interpretation of history. So, the wisest way to read Ridley is not as the final word on every case, but as a forceful corrective to a different distortion. The idea that progress is mainly designed from above, or that the messy, commercial, decentralized world of tinkerers, users, firms, and trial-and-error improvers is somehow secondary. Even readers who disagree with some of his politics may still find his central reframing powerful. And that is probably why the book stays with people. At the deepest level, it is not really about gadgets. It is about civilization's hidden operating system. Progress is collaborative. Progress is fragile. Progress depends on permission to test, to combine, to borrow, to fail, to improve, and to distribute. It is social before it is heroic. It is cumulative before it is cinematic. It often arrives in forms that look mundane until they become indispensable. A bed net. A numbering system. A container. A vaccine platform. A better engine. A better crop. A better way to connect. Ridley's gift is to show that these are not separate stories. They are one story. Human beings repeatedly rearranging reality into forms that help more people live better lives. So, if you wanted to compress how innovation works into one clean takeaway, it would be this. Human progress is not a parade of miracles delivered by isolated masterminds, but an evolving ecosystem of experiments that flourish when people are free enough to try, combine, adapt, compete, and try again. Read the book if you want the stories, because they are rich. Read it if you want a stronger theory of why some ideas spread and others die. Read it if you want to rethink how modern prosperity was actually built. And maybe most of all, read it if you want to stop romanticizing innovation and start respecting what it really asks of a society: openness, patience, risk tolerance, humility, and room for people to surprise each other. If this summary gave you value, like it, share it, and leave a comment with the example that stayed with you most, or just write, "I choose progress," to mark the shift. Keep the momentum going. Keep building your own map of the world, and I'll see you in the next summary.